Hey there, everybody. I'll give you a little heads up here as we get started, and we're going to jump right into it today. This one is going to be a little bit longer than normal, I think. So get yourself comfy if you're at home, prop your feet up, maybe have your cup of coffee to keep you going, because this time we're getting into something that's just going to take a little bit longer to get through. And because you like me so much, it'll work out. You know, I was my original teaching, my undergrad degree was in history education, and so I enjoy history. I enjoy studying it. I enjoy reading it. I enjoy trying to learn more, and I enjoy trying to share that with others. That's a decent part behind what we're doing here. But over the last, especially 30, 40 years, but in the last 20 years, you've really seen it pick up steam. The idea of revisionist historians. And when we say revisionist, we mean people who don't actually either know history or know history and lie about it. Um, and what they try to do is to, when it comes to the founders in our nation, they try to change it to fit what they want it to be, believe, and be, because they want this nation not to be something special. Um, and so they try to teach that none of our founding fathers, none of our documents, none of our history are related to Christianity whatsoever. They try to teach that there is no spiritual influence, that there's no spiritual heritage to our nation. And yet, if you take a real honest look at history, looking at the actual documents, it tells us something completely opposite. And we see that in our study today, along with, I think, a couple of pretty big lessons. All right, let's review real quick. We've looked at four of our founders so far, and we'll see. I'll probably get back to some more here as well soon. And we've learned lessons for our lives from all four of them, different lessons. Last time, I was sitting in front of a house because of the foundation that is under buildings. And we looked at the foundation of our nation, which was the first real civil document in American history, the Mayflower Compact. This time, we get into the one that we celebrate every July 4th. For nearly 2 decades before the revolution came about, there was a great deal of discontent within the country. People who were seeing the downside to what the crown, the king, was doing. You saw it really start to culminate in 1765 with the Stamp Act Congress, which was to combat the Stamp Act, which was basically they had to pay a tax for every piece of paper that had anything on it. You had the tea tax, which, if you know British culture, they drink a lot of tea, which led to the Boston Tea Party, and more animosity being built over those years, really coming to a head in 1775 and 1776, where you see the creation of the Continental Congress, where representatives from around the colonies came in to discuss what to do, and they end up coming down to the Declaration is to decide that they needed to leave their nation, their native nation of Britain, and it led to the Declaration of Independence. And I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to stick with me here, because my experience as a speaker, my experience as a teacher, is that very few people have ever read the entire Declaration of Independence, and even fewer remember. There's a chance that there have some who have read it in school at some point, but none of it really sunk in. And it goes like this. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitles them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of governments. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And this is where they list their grievances against the king. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called other legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representatives' houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasion on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. For that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislature. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and acknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in intentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. And we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and maybe I'll try that word later. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, and enemies in war, in peace, friends. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliance, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That was a lot. So for those of you that tuned me out for the last 5 minutes, you can tune back in now, because there's a little bit of summary stuff here. The founders in this document established God as the source and reason. And what they established was that we get our rights from God, not man. Man does not give us our inalienable rights. Government was put into place by God and functions at the consent of the governed. That was what was in this document. Government was put in place by God so we don't have anarchy, but we don't have to tolerate tyranny. And that's what they were saying here. We don't have to tolerate the tyranny. They weren't advocating for no government, but that the government functions at the consent of the governed, that the government exists because the people, the citizens, allow it to exist and allow it to work the way it's supposed to. But we don't have to tolerate tyranny. There are some, even in the Christian world, and I was a little surprised to find this, there's some irony in it as well, but there are some pastors in this nation, some well-known ones. One is John MacArthur, who claimed the founders were wrong. They were wrong in pursuing the revolution. They were wrong scripturally. They had no biblical right to do what they did, and that they were a bunch of deists and atheists who were using Enlightenment philosophy at a path to just try to get power. Most of them, I'm guessing, are just ignorant of history and ignorant of the exegesis that went into this idea of biblical support. And the reason that we're doing this today is we're facing something not too far off. Churches are battling through trying to know when they're to fight and stand up to the government and when they're to submit, which we see in Romans 13. But there was a great deal of exegesis that went into this idea of when to stand up against the government, when we're no longer supposed to support the government and listen to them. And what's funny is that John MacArthur, who was very clearly several years ago against the founders, is now one who wrote one of the best pieces I've ever seen as to why the government can't tell the church what to do. And the founders at the time, and the vast majority of the clergy within the colonies, aligned with some of the greatest names we've known in church history: Calvin, Luther, Zwingli, and many, many others from all different parts of the world. And they were preaching that same thing, that we were to throw off basically monarchies, because many of them were living by these new doctrines. And so one of the new doctrines we saw in England in the 1600s that came about was the divine right of kings. And basically what that said was that the king was God's voice here on earth. And this is where the separation of church and state, the idea of the Establishment Clause, which doesn't say separation of church and state anywhere in the Constitution. The Establishment Clause came about because of this, that the king was the head of the church and that he claimed to be the voice for God on earth. And so they were fighting doctrines like this. And so this was nothing new to the founders and the clergy of the time, the Black Robe Regiment, because they have been fighting this as Reformation leaders, fighting tyrants for centuries. And in the foundation area, most Christian denominations during the founding era held that while they were forbidden to overthrow the institution of government and live in anarchy, they were not required blindly to submit to every law and policy. See, those in the founding era understood that the general institution of government was unequivocally ordained by God and was not to be overthrown, but that did not mean that God approved every specific government. God does not approve communism. He doesn't approve dictators who kill and punish anyone who stands up against them. God has ordained government in lieu of anarchy. He opposed anarchy, rebellion, lawlessness, wickedness. And so he wanted civil government in society, and they were to bring about the justice that would be brought against evil and against those who would try to punish or criminalize others. So there was a crucial determination in the colonists' biblical exegesis, that their determination was whether opposition to authority was simply to resist the general institution of government, or whether it was instead to resist tyrannical leaders who had themselves rebelled against God. There was a scriptural model for this that was repeated and validated when God himself would raise up leaders such as Gideon, Ehud, Jephthah, Samson, Deborah, and their whole job was to throw off tyrannical governments. They were then put in the hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. And so the founders held the view that the institution of government is not to be opposed, but that tyranny is. And it's very interesting that a man like John MacArthur, who stood against the founders, calling them wrong and unbiblical, now is one saying much the same thing. That government does not have any rights over the church. It does not have any rights. There is only one king. It is not the president. It's not the Democrats. It's not the Republicans. It's not anybody on the face of this earth. So that's part of the Declaration. But of the 56 men who signed this document, the final one to pass away was Charles Carroll. He died at an amazing age of 95. And before his passing, New York City asked him to inscribe his final thoughts on a copy of the Declaration. And this is where we start to see more of the Christian foundation. On it, he wrote that he was, quote, grateful to Almighty God for the blessings which, through Jesus Christ our Lord, he has conferred on my beloved country in her emancipation. Significantly, this founding father, in looking back over what had occurred as a result of the Declaration, wanted to specifically thank Jesus for what happened with America. There were two signers who had just preceded him a few years earlier to death, and that was John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. We've talked about John Adams here. Both were on the committee to draft the Declaration, and both died the same day, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, on July 4th, 1826. Of the two of them, Thomas Jefferson is really considered the penman of it, but many today do not know about his beliefs or his actions. See, it's very significant because many try to call out how he was at best a deist and really an agnostic. And he didn't care about God or Christ or Bible or any of that, but his actions are completely opposite of that. He was not only a strong advocate for political and national freedom, but also for spiritual freedom. He was the one that wrote the letter to the Danbury Baptists, telling them that there's a wall of separation between the church and the state. That was where that statement came from. And his whole point, if you actually read the letter, instead of being like a liberal, crazy nut job and pulling it out of context, is that you see that he was saying it was there to protect the church from the state. See, the Constitution is there, and we're going to get to this because we're going to look at the Constitution. The Constitution is there to protect the people from the government, not vice versa. And so Thomas Jefferson went on to have money in budgets for Bibles and for missionaries and for churches for the propagation of the gospel. Well, these guys believed in God. They had to believe and trust in him because there was a great deal of risk. A lot of people forget that the founders were taking a huge risk by signing the Declaration of Independence. And they experienced a great cost to the fight for freedom. John Hart was one. He was elected to the Continental Congress, where somewhere about the age of 60, he voted for the Declaration of Independence, and it said with unusual zeal, he fully understood the personal cost because by putting his name to it, because he quickly became a target of the British. See, the British went after all the signers. And it caused him to have to flee from his dying wife's bedside. He was hunted by the enemy. He wandered the countryside to avoid discovery. He rarely slept in the same place 2 nights in a row. In fact, it said he even had to sleep in the resting place of a large dog to avoid detection by a nearby British patrol. Several times he was forced to flee as fast as he could to save his neck because he had been marked for vengeance by the British. By 1777, he was finally able to return home, gathered his children together. He began to rebuild his farm and property, but he never fully recovered his health. That year on the road basically wiped him out, and he died before he even saw true independence. Richard Stockton was one of the signers of the Declaration, and he gave his life for American liberty. He grew up and practiced law in New Jersey. He had a role in the state government when it was still a British colony, and he did not let his wealth and his prosperity get in the way, his comfort, his security for the principle of signing the Declaration of Independence. And it was an act of treason against the British king, automatic penalty of death. And he understood that. And he announced to the world, quote, "With a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, fortunes, and sacred honor." Well, it wasn't long before Stockton began to suffer the consequences. 3 months after signing the Declaration, he was kidnapped by British loyalists, and he was placed in a barbaric prison where he was abused and mistreated. Congress eventually learned of his imprisonment. They tried to secure his freedom, but by the time that he got, his health was so destroyed, he never recovered from it. He died in 1781, also not seeing the finish of the war. But he maintained his Christian faith throughout his life. That was a lot. I know it was. And there was a lot more. It's crazy how much information, if you really look, is out there. But the big takeaway for me on this was the foundation of our nation. From the moment of exiting the British Empire, we called on and relied upon God. It is written into the Declaration of Independence. And because of our calling on God, because of our Christian foundation, because of our biblical exegesis by the clergy were some of the biggest ones screaming for freedom from England. There was a seismic shift in governance, that there is only one king of this world, and our rights as humans, as man, comes from him. And when we forget that, when we think it comes from the government, those nuts in Washington, D.C. do not give me my rights. They do not give me my freedom. That comes from God. When we forget that, we forget the crux of our nation. We forget the foundation, the basis. Here's what I really want you to take away from this. Those guys were relying on God not only for the nation to be able to succeed and gain freedom, but for their lives and for their livelihood. I want you to rely on God for everything. Rely on him for our everyday lives. Rely on him for our nation's life. Each nation exists because of God's providence. We exist as individuals because of God's providence. Let's turn to him more each day. Let's turn to him for our nation. Let's turn to him for its leaders, so that maybe we can once again be one nation under God. Because until we're that, we will continue to fall into chaos. Well, on that uplifting note, if you'd like to see more research and information, where I got quite a bit because they have a lot of sources there, it's wallbuilders.com. It's been one of my main sources for this, mostly because they have thousands of the original documents, letters from many of the founders, and lots of information that you can gather that actually is from then. But I do want to leave you. I'm struggling today, and I think it's the weather change living here in Michigan. Remember, no matter what happens in the election, no matter what happens with our nation, no matter what happens anywhere, God is in control. God loves you. And he wants you to be one of his children, so that you can have a peace that never ends, no matter what you face. So I leave you with our usual: be blessed, be a blessing. God loves you.